Good morning, students. Welcome to our new normal. As a result of this C-19 virus, we're going to have to go to an online format, and so you will be getting your lectures via eLearn through my recording them and you watching them. As I said in the email, I would recommend that you watch these during the regular class time to try to keep some kind of continuity going. Your papers will be submitted through Dropbox now rather than personally giving those to me. And we will also be doing tests online, and some of these logistics we'll work through. I realized we were supposed to have a test on Thursday when we returned, and we will probably still put that test up this week, but you will take it as you can. Okay, so as we move on with our lectures, we now go to the Orient, and we're going to look at some religions that began there. And obviously, the first place we go is going to be to China. Now, traditionally, it is okay for a Chinese to be a Buddhist, to be a Taoist, and to be a Confucian all at the same time. Chinese religion tends to be very, very eclectic. As a result of that, the Chinese have a problem with both Christianity and Islam because those are very exclusive religions. Both religions say you're either or you're not. And so for the Chinese mind, that is very, very difficult for them to wrap around. In fact, you'll have many temples that have been built in China that are actually shared by adherents of all of those different religions. And they would see no problem with that whatsoever in their thinking and their rationale. Now, Chinese civilization did develop in somewhat of a relative isolation from the rest of the civilized world. As a result, their language and writing, of course, are very different. The people actually thought of themselves as being the center of the universe. They regarded themselves as a sea of civilization amidst a world full of barbarians. And so they, to an extent, were very, very conceited in their attitudes as they dealt with other people. Okay, from their earliest history until the end of the Shang dynasty in the 11th century before Christ, the Chinese people basically followed a polytheistic religion, intermingled very heavily, and I cannot emphasize this enough, very heavily with ancestor worship. This really wraps up Chinese religion. Loyalty to family, reverence for the ancestors, all of these things are very, very, very important. Now, the Shang dynasty lasted from 1600 all the way down to 1050 BC. They were most noted for their bronze work, and of course, divination was very much a part of this polytheistic religion that they practice. This was followed in 1050 until 221 by the Zhou dynasty. This was where the Chinese literates came along, and many concluded that there was one supreme God above all the others. This was kind of based on the idea of a supreme ancestor, and that the nation was literally foreordained by heaven to be a leader in the world. And of course, understand, in the ancient world, the Chinese were the terminus of what are called the Silk Roads. So they were very much a part of the trade that was going on and blooming during the Bronze Age. And so they began to see themselves as very, very important. Okay, during this dynasty, classical literature develops. You have feudalism becoming very much a part of the Chinese society. Feudalism will be a part of the Japanese society. Feudalism will actually be a part of Western European society during the Middle Ages. And so it is going to be a very common feature that we see throughout the world at different times. The Qin dynasty followed. It was from 221 to 206. And this is when we have the beginnings of the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall, of course, was built to protect them from their enemies to the north and the west. And it is such a project of magnitude that literally the Great Wall can be seen from the International Space Station as it goes over. They will become, during the Qin dynasty, what we would generally call historically an empire. So this is a very, very, very important time for them. The Han Dynasty, 202 to 220 AD, this is going to be based on Confucianism. And it's very, very important that you understand this about Chinese religion. Chinese religion is definitely an outgrowth of the times in which it came into being. China is going to be convulsed by a period of civil wars. And as a result of these civil wars, there's going to be a tremendous impact upon people like Confucius, upon Lao Tzu, who we will talk about later. And these individuals are very much impacted by the slaughter. Now, where our American Civil War took between 650 and 700,000 lives, when China has a civil war, they have millions of lives that can be sacrificed. And so you can imagine the impact such an event will have upon the minds of thinking, intellectual, religiously turned type of people. And so Confucianism will be very much a part. Now, the final period of influence in China is basically going to be where foreign invasions will come through. You will have Manchus and others who will wind up on the throne of China. Ultimately, there will be European contact, and the Europeans will have a profound influence upon the Chinese people. And all of these things will form part of the Chinese personality and definitely have major impacts upon Chinese religion and how it grows and develops. So as we think about all of this history, as I say, Lao Tzu is generally credited with founding Taoism, and then Confucius, of course, is the individual who is credited with finding the And your textbook has a problem here. Is it a philosophy? Is it a religion? Is it both? And I would tend to lean to the idea that Confucianism, shall we call it a religious, political philosophy, and maybe define it that way. We find from the 6th century to the 3rd century BC, the flowering of the human mind, philosophers, schools emerge, and of course, these are going to be the times of the two legendary founders. And realize this will be the same time period as many of the Hebrew scripture prophets, and also the latter part of this period will be the time period of the rise of the Greek philosophers. So there's a lot of learning going on, a lot of thinking, a lot of changing of minds that are taking place in that particular time period. And in China, like in Israel, like in Greece, you will have philosophers building schools and training people, and these schools will send out students to teach and inform the people of what are going on in their times. Okay, now understand this early polytheism, the early divination, the ancestor worship, all of these concepts and practices play a part in the development of the philosophies of Taoism and Confucianism. The Chinese do recognize in the early stages many gods and spirits that controlled the universe, and to them, these gods and spirits could be their ancestors. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind, that they actually believed that there was a possibility that some of their ancestors became the ruling spirits in the world. They were very animistic. They had fertility cults. And if you have seen the Disney movie Mulan, you understand that going and invoking the ancestors and not doing anything to offend the ancestors was a very vital aspect of their life and their philosophy. In no way did they want to offend the family. That would be the ultimate insult, the ultimate, if you want to call it, sin that they could commit, would be that of offending the family. Now, to them, there were two kinds of spirits. You had beneficial spirits that were called Shen, S-H-E-N. Then you had evil spirits that were known as Kuri, and these are always associated with dark and gloomy places. Sounds very medieval, but very much a part of ancient Chinese thought. Now, in searching for a principle to explain the true nature of the universe, the Chinese philosophers are going to create the concept of yin and yang. Yin is the negative force in the universe. Yang would be the positive force in the universe. Yin is dark, cool, female. Yang, light, warm, male. And they did not believe that the world was actually created It just is. And that's how they deal with the world in which they found themselves and in which they lived. Again, your book emphasizes their respect and veneration of not just ancestors, but aged members of the family. For example, if we were in a classroom and we were in old China and an adult walked in the room, all of you would stand up without saying a word. You would just simply stand up and silently stand there in respect of the individual who came in. It would be very common for households to have 2, 3, even perhaps 4 generations of people living in the same complex. They weren't as mobile as we tend to be in the United States today, and they were always very, very respectful of those ancestors. To be unrespectful of living or dead ancestors would be a most horrid thing indeed. And so the aged father, the aged grandmother, the mother, the father, all of these people would very much dominate the Chinese home. And young people, quite honestly, would learn their place. And their place was not telling the adults what to do, how to do it, how to live, or anything else. So this is a very, very important aspect. A child was obligated to maintain the gravesite of these ancestors, to remember them, to remember their deeds, to offer sacrifices to them. All of these were very, very important aspects of Chinese life. And if you forgot your ancestors, you were literally disgraced in life, and your ultimate goal was to be a homeless ghost. Just wander around the world, kind of like we see in A Christmas Carol. Marley just wandering around doing penance. Well, that would have been very much Chinese thought. So Chinese people did not generally disrespect their ancestors in any shape, form, or fashion. Okay, they did practice divination. We've talked about that. The Greeks practiced divination. The Romans practiced divination. So not something totally unusual in the ancient world. Normally, their means of divination was to look at the shells of a turtle or somehow stalks of grain, and they would try to make predictions of the future based on these ideas and what they noted and saw in those things. So beginning about the 11th century BC, the Zhou rulers began to assert the right to rule based on morality and religion. And they further asserted that one supreme God controlled all the destinies of humankind, and this God was named Shang Di. And he had originally been regarded as the patron of the Shang dynasty. And of course, that's why the name Shang Di. But he becomes promoted, shall we say. He was more than simply an ancestor. He was a supreme God. In fact, it was said he brought down the Shang dynasty because they became immoral. That's why the Zhao dynasty will act on the idea of morality. The leaders will serve as kind of priest kings, leading worship in a central ancestral type of temple. And Shang Di was seen then as a rewarder of good morality and a punisher of immorality. And do they borrow some of these ideas from the Hebrews? Well, we don't have documented connections that they actually did, but there are definitely some hints of Hebrew religion in some of these ideas of rewarding good and punishing evil. Some scholars have even suggested that the Chinese of this period were close to developing an ethical monotheism similar to what was enumerated by the Hebrew prophets. And so trade through India may have actually provided some of these ideas to them. Okay, during the Zhao dynasty, China was organized and governed by a feudal system. So society was stratified into ranks. Members of society knew their ranks and they knew their duties. They also knew who was above them and who was below them. And realize part of this may come about from the fact that China was relatively near India. And as you recall, when we talked about the Indian religions and so on, we emphasized the fact that society was very, very, very stratified in India, and there was no real motion and movement between one level of society and another. That is not always true in China. There will be means by which people can move up the social ladder. Usually it is going to be done through warfare, but there is a way to be able to move up. So after several centuries, roughly around 5, this feudal system begins to break down. And what is going to happen is the development of warlords. And these warlords provided protection to the various peasants, and in tribute, if you will, for being protected by the warlords, the peasants in turn would turn around and then pay the warlords with food and, if necessary, with military service if the warlords went to war. And of course, this is going to be that period that is going to influence Confucius so much in his thinkings and philosophies, because he's going to see all the destruction that takes place. So it is during this era that the Chinese schools, each with its own distinctive answers to the nation's problems, are going to arise. Now, you're going to have 3 major groups arise. And at different times, each one of these groups will have a prominent role in what China is and how China develops. Okay, the Confucians, and this is important that you get these 3 distinctions. The Confucians dreamed of an idealized form of feudalism. Confucius is very respectful of the past. He's very honoring of the past. In fact, he looks at the past almost with a reverence. And this is what we need to go back to. A second group will come along, and they are called legalists. And the legalists will want a strong centralized government, tight control. Keep the people in line. Don't let them get out of bounds in any shape, form, or fashion. And then our third group are going to be called Taoists. And basically, they want as little government as possible. Now, the Taoists would be somewhat idealist in that they would believe that most people are basically really good. And so this is how they think we don't need much government because people are pretty much gonna do their job. Okay, so let's look at Taoism first. Now realize you're sitting there, it's spelled with a T, not a D. But the Chinese pronounce a T like a D. So that's why I'm doing this. And if you wonder where I got this, actually the first semester I taught this course, I had a student who spoke Chinese. So that student helped me quite a bit with some of the terms that I will be using as we have these discussions. Okay, the name Taoism comes from the title of a book, and it is called Tao Te Ching. It is possibly best translated the way, or maybe more fully, the way of nature. Now, let's realize China is a dominantly agrarian society. And so getting along with nature, cooperating with nature, understanding nature, being able to work with nature, all of these things are going to be very, very important with the Chinese people. And so we've got to get along with nature because this is where eternal order, and order is a very important concept with Chinese. This is where the cosmos has its order. And so by the time we develop into the post-Christ period, Taoism has been converted more from a nature practice into a religion that is complete with God, priests, temples, sacrifices. And in modern China, and realize modern communist China very much suppresses most religion. Taoism is mainly associated with charms, exorcisms, and magical attempts to prolong life. So in modern China, Taoism is not taken very seriously at all, especially by those that are in any shape, form, or fashion involved with the government. Okay, the founder of Taoism is thought to be an individual by the name of Lao Tzu, who lived in the 6th century, and most scholars will now say that the basic philosophy of Taoism is actually much, much older than that. By the way, this may not actually be a name. It may be more of a title. The term can mean the old boy or the old fellow. And that not is not always uncommon. In the Hebrew Bible, we have the book of Malachi, and many scholars are not sure if that is a proper name, which it could be, or if it simply is a title that prophet took, which means my messenger. And so it was not uncommon for people to have designations, and those become identified like a name. Okay, the Zhou dynasty during its last years was breaking down. Political order was a mess, and the country is in turmoil. And yet, we probably know less about the founder of Taoism than we do about any of the other founders of world religion about which we have or we will talk in the rest of this class. He never preached to be recorded. He never organized a group of disciples or followers. He never promoted himself or his religion, but he did write. And his writings are what have formed the foundation of this religion. And as we said, the Tao Te Ching is the most influential book in that religion, but probably in all of Chinese religion. So getting along with nature, being able to harvest, do your planting, getting your crops irrigated, all of these things were very, very, very important in an agrarian society, and Taoism fit very well into such a society as that. It is also generally agreed the book developed over many centuries and that it evolved. You know, people would add to and change things that had originally been written or been written before. But usually around about the 4th century BC is when the book pretty much solidified into its present form. Okay, the early teaching of Taoism, and let's realize a nature religion, is based upon some central themes. So let's listen to these. Number 1, the basic unity behind all the universe is a mysterious and indefinable force called the Tao. As I say, usually the word means the way. So you've got this force that is the way. Sounds a little bit like Star Wars, if you think about it. Okay, it may be best understood in terms of the way of nature or nature's way. So this way is the ultimate reality, and it underlies all that is considered nature. Okay, we're talking about an agrarian people. We're talking about a farm people. And true Taoists are going to live a very simple farm-type life. They're not going to be the movers and shakers. They're not going to be the people going out and creating and causing wars. They're going to be people that know their job. They're working with the various forces of nature. They want to grow their crops. They want to take care of their families. They want to honor their ancestors. And this is just very simply the lifestyle they wish to live and practice. Number 2, life is the greatest of all possessions. Okay, the Tao is responsible for life, so that seems very fitting to a thought like that. But to them, fame, wealth, power, education, these things are just kind of fleeting illusions. You remember some of our Indian religions talked about the fact that, excuse me, that life was an illusion and people needed to be able to overcome that. It rejected all forms of self-assertiveness and of competition. So obviously in the U.S. today, you couldn't be a Taoist and be an avid football player. It just wouldn't go together. It was a good way, though, to control the masses. Just as the Indians had the caste system, the Taoists used this as peasants, be happy, stay in your place, be satisfied with who you are, what you are, be the best who you can be, and so on. And so it would give leadership, it would give the military, it would give those that want to assume some kind of power and control a great levy over the average people of China. And perhaps we can say here fairly accurately that most people in China just really wanted to be left alone to live their lives, do their work, and take care of their families. And so this worked very well to help keep people like that, quote, in place. Then number 3, life is to be lived simply. They basically turned their backs on civilization with all of its ills as well as its benefits. And in doing so, it would be more of a rural religion rather than an urban type of religion. Let us get back to nature. Now, quite honestly, we will see some of this come out in what is called the Enlightenment, which is a movement that will take place in Europe in the early modern era. And during the Enlightenment, there'll be a lot of Enlightenment leaders, philosophes as they are called, and they will want to return to nature, to the simple life of nature. Many of them will edify and uplift the lives of individuals who were living on some of the Pacific Islands as being the ideal lifestyle and not the European city lifestyle with its ruling classes and urban sprawl and everything else. And so there will be people that will long for this simple type of lifestyle. And there are still some farmers in the United States today, and that's exactly what they want. They love that lifestyle. They wouldn't go anywhere. They're multi-generational farmers. That's what their parents did, their grandparents did, probably their great-grandparents before them, and they enjoy that lifestyle. So this simple life is to be lived in rhythm with nature. And the idea that through doing nothing, and James, I know you're going to flip out on this one, and I'm sorry, but through doing nothing, you can get all things done. Now, to us in the U.S., obviously, that sounds absurd. You have to exert action to get things done. But that was their simple lifestyle. That was the way they wished to live, and that's how they sought to conduct themselves. Okay, number 4, pomp and glory were to be despised. So military parades, military let's show our arms, and things of this nature, that would have been totally foreign to the mind of a Taoist. They would have wanted absolutely nothing to do with anything like that. Their idea was each person should be content to live as the Tao intended, without seeking to rise above other people. And if you did that, life would be as it should be. And so, in doing this, the way of life, doing what you're supposed to do without trampling over other people, in doing that, your life then would become meshed with that of the Tao itself. Okay, there is little theism, according to your textbook, in early Taoism. The Tao was an impersonal, vague force behind the universe, maybe more of a first cause than a God in the traditional sense of that word. And early Taoists seem to have had little concern about life after death. They were decided that only the most virtuous of all people could be favored by something similar to heaven. And so it was only very, very special people that were able to enjoy such benefits as that. They were concerned not with what's going to happen to you after you die, but what's going on in life on a day-by-day basis. How are you living today? If we go back to India, what kind of karma are you practicing today? And so on. Although what we call opposites in Western society, the Taoists would have simply believed that those were in tension with each other, that the yin and the yang complete and balance each other. Does it sound a little bit like Star Wars to you? Could it be that some of the ideas that were used there came out of early Taoism and so on? So what you want to do is have balance, good and evil, light, darkness, etc. And so in life, living this simple, denying pomp and glory, being who you're supposed to be, trying to become one with the Tao, supposedly all of this works together to bring that balance that they are looking for in life. Okay, you can imagine. We're talking about balance. No pomp, no glory, nothing like this. And then we've got a civil war going on. We've got warlords struggling against one another. We've got people trying to take power from other people and so on. So you could see Taoist philosophy just being thrown away by so many people in China. And they believed that their philosophy was literally a challenge to the very structures that had become a part of the era in which they lived. And so they were a challenge to everything that was going on. So, as the Taoists get challenged, many of them begin to question what they believe and teach and understand and so on. We begin to have the rise of the Confucians. And they would have been obviously a rival force against the Taoists in the 3rd and 4th century, and they would have been trying to advise the rulers of China. Now, Confucius believed that ideal feudalism was the best form of government. He believed that the rites and rituals of religion served to help unite a people, bring them together in sort of a common cause. And as he looks at the destruction, the confusion, all that is going on, he literally idealizes the ancient past. Paints probably a very fantastic, fanciful picture of what the past was like. But yet he is stressing to the rulers of his day and time, we can go back and we can achieve that if we work at it hard enough. Well, idealized feudalism is probably not the perfect form of government, but looking at the chaos and everything that was going on, to Confucius and those who followed him, obviously it was way better than what was going on. And so it was offered as a substitute. So as he comes along and offers this substitution to Taoism, the legalists go further and say, no, we really need a strong, strong government that's going to crack down on the people, that's going to control the people, that's going to control all the people. And so we see the three philosophies and how they kind of mesh in China. Now, the one thing about the legalists, they would reject this traditional, idealized feudalism, and they would have been very concerned about expanding the state, about building it up, making it more dynamic, making it more involved in trade, and making sure that the state is getting the very best when trade is taking place. And so, in all of this mix, later Taoism, as I say, kind of retreats. And it retreats out into the countryside. There will be some who will begin to search for immortality. There will be others, as Taoism develops, that will try to come up with potions and diets and concoctions and whatever else to extend this present life as long as they possibly can. Now, this would kind of be opposite in thought from Indian religion, that you recycle and come back in different lives. To the Taoists, you want to extend this one as long as possible. So, as I said in the very beginning of this lecture, it is obvious that Taoism is, like any Chinese religion, very eclectic, and there are going to be a lot of expressions of it. So you're going to have scholars, priests, magicians, come along and begin to seek the means whereby life can be extended. And they will think of every means possible. They will go on dietary restrictions. They'll have very detailed what you can and you cannot eat and so on. They will teach and stress selflessness, cleanliness, emotional calm. And in doing all of this, you will be able then to claim full knowledge, and this will ultimately be climaxed in a deep meditation. So again, kind of a more rural, more countryside religion than we might possibly see than we will ultimately see, I guess I should say, in Confucianism and so on. So alchemists, but people that work in pharmacies and so on, these are going to come along and they're going to try to work up potions and stuff to keep people alive and keep them going. Sounds very much like life in America today. But if they gave you a potion, they would also give you a certain ritual, and the ritual they gave you would have to be followed exactly for the potion to have its desired effect. Ultimately, Taoism will begin to develop its own hierarchy of gods. But again, this is part of the evolutionary process. Now, during the 2nd century, during the Han Dynasty, which reigned for several centuries, again, we have a breakdown, and Taoism will actually have a revival. There will be, in 184, a Taoist revolt. This revolt will eventually fail, but because of its influence, the religion will really grow quite a bit. It'll take roots once again in Chinese society and among the average mass of Chinese people by the beginning of the 3rd century of the modern era. Now, as we get to the 3rd century, and let's realize Christianity would have been around now for 2 centuries, and by the 3rd century, Christianity would have reached China. And so in that 3rd century, it begins to evolve into a religion of salvation. And it will develop a greater organization, a greater hierarchy. It will offer a variety of routes to paradise. And you can go through devotion, through charity, you can go through abstinence, you can go through service. So obviously, in opposition to Christianity, it would be a work-oriented type of religion, but your life still centered, as far as the Taoists were concerned, upon the local community. Well, by the 3rd century BC, so 600 years before, Buddhist missionaries are coming into China, and these rituals are going to somewhat mesh in with Taoism and become an accepted part of it. Both religions are going to borrow from each other, but quite honestly, Buddhism is going to eventually become more popular and begin to win out over Taoism, and there's going to be a period of Taoist persecution. But by the 10th century, what still exists as Taoism today has pretty much been established, and it still is based on this traditional idea of a magical means of extending life. And so this is kind of where Taoism wound up going and evolving itself to. All right. Confucianism is definitely woven into the total philosophy, number one, of the Chinese people, number two, of the historical circumstances in which it originally arose. All of these things are going to have very, very profound effect on it. Now, I want to share something with you from your textbook, because this explains the confusion of scholars as they begin to look at Confucianism. Your textbook says, if Confucianism is a religion, it is a very different kind of religion. It has no priesthoods. Its sacred writings, although important, have never been considered a divine revelation. It is frowned upon asceticism and monasticism, and it has no doctrine of an afterlife. So that's why at the beginning of this lecture today, I said perhaps the best way to look at Confucianism is that it is a religious, political type of philosophy. Now, Confucius is actually not the founder's name. His name was Kung. Confucius is kind of a Latinized form of the name, and he was born approximately 551 BC. So again, as Greek philosophy is just beginning to enter its classical age, as the Hebrew prophets are in their prime and influencing the Jewish people, along comes Confucius. So it is a definitive time of a lot of deep thinking in various aspects of Afro-Eurasia. People are searching for answers, and Confucius is going to enter that and try to come up with a way to help people in life. Now, interestingly, he was raised by a widowed mother. So basically, he grew up in poverty. However, he was allowed to study with a village tutor, so he was not illiterate by any stretch of the imagination. In his late teens, he accepted a minor position in the government, and he studied what was going on in government. His goal at this time was actually, and if you remember Chinese history at all, in the government, based on achievement and ability, you could move up the ladder. And so his goal was to have a higher political office. So rather than becoming a philosopher, Confucius actually wanted to be a politician. But China was destroying itself. And folks, that's just a great way to look at what a civil war does. People destroy themselves. And so his chief issue was with all the anarchy that was going on around him. And he was highly, highly concerned about these things. So during his 20s, he began his true career, and that will be as a teacher. He will become China's first philosopher. He will have people follow him on his journey. So, in this respect, he was somewhat like Jesus had been. He wandered about from place to place, teaching and drawing disciples together, and so on. In doing so, he would teach history, the principles of good government, divination, and what we would generally call humanities. To him, the heroes of that golden age of China, quote, were who he considered to be the founder kings. And he was obsessed with tradition. He saw in it the ability to shape attitudes. And when tradition is no longer unquestioned, he felt that it must be reinforced. So, like many in the Hebrew religion who, during the day of Jesus, were more bound by tradition than they were the teachings of God through Moses and the prophets, Confucius thought tradition was so very important. And if you must, you impose it. Part of this is control of young people. Let's make sure we've got them in line. Let's make sure they're on the page we want them to be on. And ultimately, he will be forced to retire from his governmental position because he began to differ so much philosophically with the movers and shakers of China at that time. So during the years of his life when he is, shall we say, most effective in building Confucianism, he is just going to wander around with a group of disciples. Sometimes he'll be treated very well and hospitably received. At other times, he'll be jeered at and fail. He will ultimately become an advisor to a duke. But this is actually not as important as the position he had earlier held, but it at least gave him a place to settle down and teach and train his disciples. During this last period of his life, he will build a home for himself. He'll compile some of the classical Chinese texts, and his most faithful disciples will supposedly build a hut beside his grave, and they will mourn him for several years when he dies about 479. His teachings are contained in about 20 books called the Lin Yu. And as we think about Confucius as an individual and who he was, we are told he was a rather pleasant fella. He was courteous to people. He was modest. He was self-controlled. And he was a zealot in the belief of, or a zealot with, I guess is a better way to put it, a sense of humor. Many of his teachings would be considered rather lighthearted. So this personal character that he developed within himself worked very well as far as going and building a fellowship and people who would carry on his ideas and his traditions. Now, one thing we need to emphasize here, notice even though he was a philosopher, he was still, as long as he could, working within the government, because here is where he thought if he could make his changes and that the government would take his philosophy and make it the philosophy of all of China, that this would make a better China. So he tried to work as best he could with the government. But as we think about him in relationship to the various gods and so on, he was at least an agnostic, if he was not an all-out atheist as far as his beliefs were concerned. He believed service to gods was totally meaningless, especially without service to other people. To him, this was the most important thing. Now, he believed, again, that the gods probably existed and that their worship and rituals brought people together. But to him, these were of secondary importance in comparison to a good social order with people believing and working together in a good, moral, workable system whereby people were good to each other. Now, obviously, living in a time of civil war, he wasn't seeing a whole lot of humanity. He wasn't seeing the best of people coming out. And so this religious philosophy or this moral philosophy was very, very important. And so what happens is he will develop a system of ethics, a theory of government, and a set of personal and social goals that will influence the Chinese people. Now, it will be dominated by magic. It will be dominated by alchemy, so he does borrow both of these from Taoism. But a system of ethics is how your textbook tries to describe what he was actually doing. Okay, this is actually a good stopping point for us because we want to begin the